Hello, everybody, and good morning. Thank you so much for tuning into the show yet again. I'm here to tell you guys that it is about time that you follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen. I know y'all are out there listening and you're not subscribing and you're not following the show, and I don't like that kind of behavior. You guys know I'm tired of working these garbage jobs, wasting my time. The links are in the description of the show wherever you listen. All the links, all the social media links, all the different platforms. Wherever you listen, all I ask is to subscribe, to follow. Please, please, I'm begging you, subscribe, follow, and most importantly, enjoy today's episode. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning into the show today on this lovely, what's it going to be? It'll be a Thursday morning for everybody when they hear it. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Ximena Sevilla, who is a professor at University of Rhode Island, local. Everyone knows I'm living in Rhode Island, but how are you today? It's great to have you.
Hello.
Yeah, it's I'm very happy that I think I had sent you out the email quite some time ago, but yeah, better late than never. That's the saying.
Yes, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of what I want to talk to you about, I do want to let everyone know that the topic that we're going to dive into a little later on is incredibly interesting. I mean, ancient civilizations and understanding what it is that got our DNA to be what it is now and how we act as humans now all stems from back then. So it's incredibly interesting, and I can't wait to get into that. But before we do that, I just would like you to tell everybody what you teach and what your background kind of is at URI and how you got there.
All right, so those are big questions. Thank you so much. This is my second year teaching at the University of Rhode Island as an assistant professor, and I teach all the Latin American history classes. So far, I taught Latin American history, like the civilizations overall, like the survey class, the 100 level, and now I'm teaching history of modern Latin America. And then a year ago, I taught. It was kind of like a 300 level class that it was called The History of the Andes and the Amazon Worlds. So those are I am from Peru, and I finished my PhD here in the States, and I wanted to continue teaching and doing research. So my choice was, okay, I'm going to apply to different jobs, and I was lucky that I got the job here at URI, and I was able. I am the historian of Latin America here, and I get to know students here from Rhode Island and elsewhere who have different backgrounds, and I teach them a little bit about, Latin American history is something that somehow we're all close to something that has to do with Latin America, whether it's music or food, or like we have an idea of it. But here in the States and in New England, I found it that my students see it as a fascinating topic. So I get students who they might not know a whole lot about Latin America, but they learned and they are happy to learn more about it. So it's not that they just take the class as a requirement. It's actually that they are interested in the subject, which is pretty fun as a professor.
Right. Yeah. Well, up here in the Northeast, we're pretty far geographically from Latin America.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's a distance, and it's not like, we learn a little bit more the history of Europe and the history of the United States, of course, right? I mean, you have some exposure to that, but it's different when we're thinking about Latin America. And Latin America is, it's just Latin America. But when you think about Latin America, you can think about different regions, different parts of Latin America, right? What does it even mean to be part of Latin America? And then how do we make sense about all the people who are and identify themselves as Latin Americans, but they live elsewhere? So that's another area too. When we think about Latin America, we think about Latin America, yes. And the people who live there, yes. But I mean, I'm from Latin America and I live here in Rhode Island, and there's a lot of people like that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing in the Northeast. It's so old that there's been generations and different cultures that have come here. A question I had while you were kind of talking about the different regions of Latin America, what kind of constitutes that? Is that just like kind of Spanish-speaking countries in the North American region and South American region?
Well, I mean, it's been discussed because it really is just to have a reference, an idea of all the, in theory, all the Latin rooted languages that are spoken, right? So that's why Brazil counts as Latin America, and people like for example, in the Caribbean, people who speak French, right? So you have kind of like that, and because they either speak Spanish, French, Portuguese, whatever that language is, it comes from a Latin root. So that's why, I mean, it was coined that people coming from these regions are Latin Americans in Latin America. In reality, I mean, there's right now, I think there's a lot of, movement in terms of how is that ideas that we had before that we took for granted. Like Latin America exists, but we haven't really thought about what that means and why is that we're thinking about, we're thinking about Guatemala, but we're not thinking about other countries. So what does that mean? And if that excludes or includes people who feel who have parents that are from Guatemala, but they are born here in the States, right? So that's being from Latin America excludes that, right? So now we have a little bit more inclusive terms to talk about people in general, Latinx, Latine, and that kind of like brings up a question that, I mean, people in Latin America, they just don't speak only languages that are rooted in Latin, right? They also speak multiple indigenous languages. So it's kind of like trying to be more inclusive in the way that we speak, which is, I mean, it's something that is changing a little bit, not just in this instance, but it just, I mean, we need to challenge the way that we refer to things and people all the time. And I think that being from Latin America and the whole thing about Latin America is going to change a little bit more the more I see it, I think.
Right. Now, you being from there, was there more of a stress or more of a, I don't know, in school, was there more of a curriculum based around learning the history of Latin America in that land, and how extensive was it?
Well, I mean, like when you're in school, you just learn the basic history, the one from textbooks were probably not really that challenged. I don't even remember what I learned when I was in college. Yes, there were many options on whether you wanted to study by period or by region, right? And it was all just about Latin America. So my first approach really to academia, and that's kind of like a way to direct the conversation more into what I do now, is that I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to see something else. I didn't know what was the career that was going to take me there, but I knew that I wanted to find out cool stuff, right? And I wanted to talk to people, and I wanted to learn about other ways of being, right? So my intention, like the adventurous side of me, if you want to call it, I thought sociology was a good fit for me, and in general, like social sciences, because it gave me that. It gave me the approach to people that I wanted, the way that sociology is taught at the college level in Peru is more like it's a little bit similar than anthropology, which is kind of like you learn the different theories about just kind of like understanding how people are, and then you try to find out more things about that. I mean, that's a very simplified way, but so sociology was for me the best approach that I could get. So my bachelor's is in sociology, and I really thought that that was going to be it. I didn't think that I was going to end up being a professor, and for me it was more about exploring and what avenues would I choose to do that, and all those took me to grad school. So when I wanted to know more and I wanted to learn more, and that's how I decided to get my master's in anthropology. And that was kind of like here in the United States. I got my master's in anthropology, and that's when I started working with indigenous people in the Amazon region. I am from Peru, but I'm not from that area. I'm from Lima, the capital city, which is just like a huge city of more than 10 million people living there, close to the ocean. And my reality as a middle class woman goes to college is very, very different from the reality of other areas in Peru, and specifically even more so the reality of indigenous people in the Americas, right? And to that extent, I decided to work on my master's thesis, thinking about indigenous people in this specific area in the northern part of Peru, in the Amazon region, because I didn't know about that, right? I didn't know, and I wanted to know more. So that has always been the drive for me, which is like, oh, I didn't know this existed. I'm just going to check it out and find out more about this. And the more I learned about indigenous people in the Amazon, in this specific region, and I always say in this specific region because, and for all the listeners, I know you know that there are different indigenous groups everywhere, right? I mean, we can talk about indigenous groups, different indigenous groups living in the States, different indigenous groups. So when we think about the Amazon, we need to think about many, many, many different indigenous groups that live in the Amazon region. And when we think also about the Amazon, we kind of like, it's part of the conversation at the beginning of what does it mean to be from Latin America? What does it mean? What does the Amazon mean, right? And when you think about the Amazon, to what extent that's very different to the view or the perspective that I have about the Amazon, because it's like a lot of people might not know a whole lot about Latin America, but they have heard about the Amazon and they have an idea in their minds about the Amazon and what the Amazon is, which is fascinating because across the world, I mean, I don't know, out of the 10 people that I would choose, probably all of them know about the Amazon, right? They have an idea about what the Amazon is. But we don't really, and we know about the ecological diversity, right? We know about how it may look like, right? If you think about the Amazon, you probably think about a forested area, right? Like, I mean, that would be a first guess, right? But we don't really think about the many different indigenous groups that live there. We don't really think about how is that within the Amazon, within this huge territory that is considered the Amazon. We're thinking about different countries. It's not just Brazil. You have Colombia, you have Ecuador, you have Peru, you have Bolivia. They all share a part of this big, big territory. And because of that, the geography within the Amazon changes and varies. And because the geography, varies, it's only expected that the cultural diversity is there as well, right? We're not just talking about birds and animals. We're also talking about groups of people who have made a living there for generations and generations, and they speak different languages. They just have different ways of facing life. So going back to my research is that I decided to look at a specific group in the northern part of the Amazon region that speak Quechua. And Quechua is an indigenous language that it was, it was the indigenous language that most of the people spoke in South America by the time that the Europeans showed up. And so, so this Quechua, it's a language that still, I mean, many people from different parts of the Andean region. I mean, when we're talking about Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, like all that, when you think about South America, you need to think, the first thing that you need to think of is the Andean mountains, right? Because that is kind of like the backbone of South America. So from there, when you think about the Andean mountains, you think about the places that surround the Andean mountains and the countries that have kind of like that are shaped by the Andean mountains. And from that, you have people who speak Quechua among other different indigenous language. But I mean, the population of people speaking Quechua, I mean, there is a number of people that speak Quechua. I mean, percentage-wise, I don't remember, but it's just a large number of people speaking this language. And then, so my research I wanted to find out more about indigenous groups that are not necessarily located in this Andean region, but they are in the Amazonian region, and I wanted to know more about that. So that's how my research started. That's how I did field work there, ethnographic work, which is kind of like going and conducting interviews and just trying to get a sense of, my idea was to see what were the main challenges that these indigenous organizations were facing in terms of their territorial rights. I mean, to what extent right now the territory, the place, right? I mean, in a very, very blatant way, to what extent the place where they live, it's a place that has been officially recognized to be theirs, right? And if not, what are the problems they are facing to get that recognition? So that was kind of like a very, very direct question that I had when I did my field work for my master's in anthropology. And then when I was done with that, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to learn more about the history of this region and the history of the people living in this region? I mean, because there is kind of like a problem in terms of the scholarship that you have historians have written a lot about the Andean parts of South America, right? Because there are more sources about that, but not so much about the Amazon region. And social scientists have done much work in this area, right? But there wasn't really something that I could find about the history of this region. So I thought it was a good idea for me to get trained as a historian, right? And that's why I got a PhD. And out of that PhD, my main research was about this region, not just about the people, but about the region itself, right? What's the history of it? Who were the people kind of like going in and out and interacting with this region, and why? Why was this region special at all, right? When we think about, I mean, it is special, but why specifically this region? So that's how I started my research, thinking about the place and the people who interacted with this place. And I thought about kind of like, if I wanted like a broad history, kind of like a history that is just it will give you a sense of what happened. So I started looking at sources from the really 1600s. I started in the 1600s and I went all the way to the 19th century because those were the sources that I found about that place. And that was just, I mean, how my research evolved. And that's what I do now. I focus on this region and I focus on the people who lived in this region, not just today, but in the past, and how is that they have interacted with different groups of outsiders that try to also make sense. They tried also to make sense about this area.
Right. Wow. I mean, it seems like your desire to explore has brought you to all different kinds of places, but and one of them being the Amazon. We'll get into that in a second, but I did want to bring up I guess, the common understanding for a while was that rainforests, typically you can't grow food there. You can't maintain a civilization. But as of recent, there's been evidence found that through clearing of the forests, there are things that shouldn't be there, like evidence of massive civilizations, which begs the question, what kind of people could have been there? They had to have been an advanced civilization to be able to take an environment where everything is the odds are against them to live, and they were able to manipulate it in a way to change the factors in their favor. It had to have been an incredibly advanced civilization.
I mean, yes, but that is not just the case of the Amazon. That is the case of everywhere, right? I mean, they had to face the conditions of the climate conditions, and they had to also make sense of the geography so they could survive. So that's kind of like an exercise that we can do with every single group of indigenous people. In the case of the Amazon, it is true that when we think about it, and if we only think about it as a rainforest, it makes it harder for us to imagine that there are people there, and the people who live there, they had a history, right? A history, whether it's a history of survival, whether it's a history of mobility, right? In the case of the Amazon, indigenous people have had to constantly move their entire communities so they could go and try to stay away from all these outsiders that always wanted something out of the region and the people who lived in these regions. So it is more what makes it harder to track them down is not really that there was nothing there. It's more than it's hard because you had at some point indigenous groups who lived in one area, but then they decided to move elsewhere because they were attacked or they were kidnapped, right? By all these different colonization entities like colonizers and, different groups of outsiders, not necessarily, during the colonization era, yes, the colonial period, but even after the colonial period, you have just outsiders who want to take advantage of the resources coming from the Amazon. And then the way to do that is by employing, I'm actually thinking about them using indigenous peoples as a way of free or cheap labor and to get those resources, right? And those conditions were not good for indigenous people, so they decided to flee as much as possible if it was within their possibilities to do so. So I mean, the idea, yes, the idea that people, there is like no room to think about people in the Amazon. Luckily, that is changing, right? Like you said, you have archaeologists, you have geologists, right? You have people, not necessarily historians, you have people who can attest how is that for thousands and thousands of years, you have people who've been interacting with that environment and in a successful way, and they still do it, and that's still happening, right? I mean, the mobility that rivers allowed people and how much knowledge they had about the place and the geography, that allowed them to survive, of course, and that's something that is still happening. I mean, COVID showed a face of the Amazon to the rest of the world that a lot of people didn't know or were not aware. And the situation is that some of the indigenous groups or indigenous communities that live today in the Amazon, they are still very isolated and they are still very far away from any source of, a hospital or even a school. Those are too far somehow, and it's really hard for some of those indigenous communities to have access to these resources, and COVID made it even harder, and because of that, a lot of the people who live in the Amazon today, and we're thinking about millions of people, they have had to face COVID by themselves, right? And they had to just make it work in a way that they could survive. But it just presents the same patterns that have happened in the history, which is like the interaction between indigenous peoples and outsiders has created all these conditions that have really prevented indigenous people from stay in the place that they wanted to stay at the beginning, because they were either, like I said already, that would have cost them their survival.
Right. Yeah. Plus it's interesting that you brought up COVID, because you would think that a people that are so isolated from everybody else, that maybe there's a chance that COVID doesn't affect them. It doesn't even get in their communities. And then if it does, they have very little resources to help them with. And that's also what had happened historically with the Spanish and smallpox, wiping out all different kinds of indigenous people. Exactly,
right? It brings up... history repeats itself again. When it's hard, because, like I said, you can take a full day walking in the forest to get to some of these indigenous communities, but you always have somebody who is going in and out, right? You always have, whether it's the young people that have to go to school, or whether it's somebody who had to go and had to kind of like go to the city for a second to go to the hospital. You have people. They are still isolated, but it doesn't mean that they have no communication, right, with what it is, what we call kind of like the outside world. So they were able to get COVID and then bring it over to their communities, and that's what caused that. So it's tricky, because it's hard to imagine it. When you think about it, you either imagine it as like very isolated and very kind of like not touched by time or anything. And then on the other side, it is the 21st century. So people have contact with other people, and they have, if they have to go and kind of like walk for 8 hours to get to a place because they have to trade the things that they grow in their plots, then they will do that. So there is communication, there is trade, there is all sorts of things happening with that interactions with other people that created, the conditions for them to get COVID, like in any other part of the world.
Sure. Now, the Amazon is an absolutely monstrous, has an absolutely monstrous surface area. I don't remember the number, but I heard it recently, and it's incredibly big, and it's interesting. And I want to ask your opinion on this. Why do you think that it is so incredibly under-researched? Why do you think that even still today, parts of it remain a mystery?
Well, I think there is a lot of research happening. It's just that, it stays in the realm of academia. So it's hard for people to have access to what is happening. Right now, things are changing a little bit more, and you have people who are interested in doing like cool projects in that area. But I think for so long, the easiest answer to your question would be that resources, right? You need resources to go there. You need to know people who are going to be able to kind of like guide you, right? And so, I mean, it's just logistically, it takes so much. And then when you think about my field, which is history, is that you're kind of like you have to do your research based on sources, right? On written sources, ideally, or any source of sources. But when those sources, you cannot find those sources, that makes it even trickier, right? There are not like there are libraries, but there are not archives, right? So where can you go so you can find documents or something related to that area? So that's harder because then you have to find the archives where you can go and see if in these archives you can find very specific information about the area. And that makes it harder. For example, I had to go to the archive of the Indies. This is my second time going, but I was there over the winter break and I was finding sources in Spain, in Seville, about the Amazon region. And it's only there that I can have access to those sources, right? Of course, I mean, if you go to the archive in Lima and if you go to the archives in Ecuador, but it's not that easy to do research there. I mean, it's just, also, it is a matter of who gets to do research, right? That's a question, right? Who gets to do research? It has to be somebody who has the credentials. It has to be somebody who has the resources. And when I say resources, money, right? Money is important, and also knowing people and kind of like the social capital that you need to have so you can do research. And then after that, what gets published? And then after that, after it gets published, who reads that?
Sure.
So, I mean, it's just so many steps that go with doing research in the Amazon that sometimes it makes sense that there is not a whole lot of research that is accessible to more people, and that we only get at the superficial level, we only get the ideas about the Amazon that we have, like the rainforest or fires, right? Or something when the Amazon is in crisis, right? Something that happened that is kind of like attention worldwide. But in terms of like specific knowledge about the area and about the people who live there, I feel like biologists have done a better job, promoting how diverse the Amazon region is and how much that means for the field of biology in general. And that is, I mean, that's always harder on the side of the humanities or the social sciences because, I mean, funding for once is completely different, right? The funding that the hard sciences get compared to the funding that humanities and social sciences get is different too. So that shapes a little bit also research and
Right.
how much research gets done in one place.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point. I didn't even think about that. But there was something I wanted to ask you, and it just absolutely slipped my mind. Oh, yes, I remember when we first spoke, kind of in our preliminary conversation when we first met each other. I think briefly we spoke of how the age that we're living in is kind of helping draw attention to these other kind of niche areas that have been forgotten about. And it's through the fact that we have a lot of information. It might not be the archived information that we're looking for, but we do have an incredible influx of information, especially nowadays. And independence, the ability for independence. Like, yes, the big sciences are getting more money, they're getting funded more, but at least the little guy has an opportunity to raise money, to raise a fund through social media, through these different outlets, and kind of eventually get a little bit momentum to get some of that research done and get some of those words out there and then promote it to the people who should be reading it or who could be reading it.
Yes, and I feel like indigenous groups throughout. I mean, South America. That's the part that I know, and they have done a great job because they are the way that they connect with other indigenous groups in different parts of the world. That has made a huge difference on the visibility that they get, also on how is that they learn from each other, and how is that they can have somehow a network of support, right? It's, I mean, every struggle that indigenous groups face is unique, of course, but at the same time it's very similar when we think about territorial rights, right? That's something that is not unique to just the group of people, the Quechua people that I was doing research with, right? It's a problem. It is a problem that it's faced by many indigenous groups in the world. So thanks to, like you said, thanks like media and all that, those connections are made, and because of those connections, is that you can see more and you can learn more about places that you didn't know anything about. So maybe you can follow somebody on Instagram, right? And then you can have an idea of what does it mean? What does it mean to live there? What does it mean? How can you see yourself and you can understand your life, that it's whatever that life you have, and then how is that you can see somebody else and understand, even if you, I mean, you've never been there, right? I mean, before social media, it was more about like who was there and who was able to travel and whatever, but now it's just like really with Instagram and Facebook, whatever that platform is, there is more visibility, and that's something that has helped indigenous groups because they can have access also to more information, and they can broaden their reach, not just to the people who live in the area where they lived, or people who are interested in knowing more about them that lived in Rhode Island, like me, right? I mean, you can find people like that, and it's all because we are in the 21st century, and those connections are happening.
Yeah, and that's also a sign of a movement, of positivity in a movement. Like if you have some middle class family, like you said, some middle class family in Illinois, and now they're interested, they want to learn more about the indigenous people in this region or that region, then that's momentum. That's the ball rolling. You're getting different people behind a cause that they see the humanity in. They don't see the veil of, hey, I am this type of person in this region and you're that type. Like they see the connection, which is huge.
Yes, right. I mean, that's part of it. I mean, when you can see it, then you can start being more empathic about what's happening, and you can create awareness, and that's something that it's changing. It's happening a little bit more, and that's the struggle of indigenous people so far, and it will always be the struggle of indigenous people. How can you identify different groups of indigenous people by understanding their own reality, and at the same time understanding that the situation of indigenous people across the world is still contested. I mean, there is still a lot of issues and problems that they are facing just for being indigenous, and that's something that's still happening. But hopefully indigenous groups, and I can only speak for the ones that I know, like the Quechua people, they are working hard in trying to kind of like expand their reach, and trying to organize themselves in a way that they can be more productive in the sense, not on productivity, but in the sense of finding what they want and how they want it. For example, in their case, it's like they need their territorial rights, right? They need that official recognition from the government of Peru. So at some point, maybe there was only one way to get there, right? And now, probably because they are more connected to other groups, other indigenous groups who have gone through the same, they can establish connections that can be more productive for what they want.
Now, how long did you spend in the Amazon?
Well,
during your coursework?
Well, it was, yeah. I mean, so I tried to go every summer, right, for a span of 5 years. So for 5 years, I was just doing field work, and that was my time there. It wasn't long enough. It was never long enough, but getting there, it's just pretty easy. You just have to, go to Lima and then take an airplane and then just go and get to the city, to the main city, which was Tarapoto. And then from there, you are already in an Amazonian city. So that my time there is being every time just a month or two, and that's it. I haven't been able to spend more than that. I haven't been there in a long time, too, because of COVID. And then before that, I was finishing my dissertation. So I haven't really been there in a long time, but I'm planning to go this summer.
Now, what was the culture shock? Because, I would imagine as, I have only lived in suburbs, since I was a kid. And I would be interested to see what it's like as an indigenous civilization and how different everything is.
Well, it's for me, it wasn't so much as a culture shock. It was more as my shock was a geography shock, because I wasn't aware of, I had an idea, of course, but I wasn't aware about the geography of it and what it would mean to go from one place to another place, right? I was just, I was not aware on how hard would it be to just, when you think, oh, you just have to walk for 5 hours, and you think, well, I can walk for 5 hours, right? You would think about that, right? You can walk.
Sure.
But in my case, it was like, yeah, I can walk for 5 hours. But then it wasn't just that. It was just, I can walk for 5 hours, but it's raining and there are mountains, and these are forested mountains. So you have to go through that. There is no real, if you get lost, you really get lost. All these different things. I thought it was going to be too hot. I was cold the whole time because it was rainy. So it was just wet and damp and everything was mud. So for me, it probably was a culture shock in terms of oh, she comes from the city and she doesn't know better. But it was more about the environment, right? It was just oh, wow, this is just, how can I do this without dying? How can I just, in terms of culture shock, indigenous people, they're just, it's not that they can live in isolated places, but it doesn't mean that they are disconnected from anything. So there is not really, most of them spoke Spanish, so I was able to communicate in Spanish. That's something that they do on a regular basis. They always, different people have to go to the cities or the towns, the bigger towns that are nearby. So all that connection is already there. So in terms of culture shock, even if you go from the suburbs, they might be something that you would think, oh, okay, I've never eaten this or I've never done this, but it wouldn't be so shocking. It would be more in terms of the environment. I think that is kind of going from a place that it has a city and then going from a rural part, right? I've just started exploring New England. So for me, going to upstate New York, I was just like, oh, wow, like this is
Very
upstate New
different.
York, right? This is like, it's very different, right? So
Sure.
that for me, that was that kind of shock that I had in terms of the geography, the environment, and how is that you connect with that. How do we do that, right? Because if we are only on our cars and we're just kind of like passing by and seeing how pretty it is, the moment that you have to walk and the moment that you have to go to one place to another, that's a little bit different, right? You have to be aware of more things. You have to be aware about the temperature. You have to be aware about altitude, right? And that's the thing. The place that I focus my research is at the edge of the Andean mountains. So even if we're talking about the Amazon, we're not really talking about the rainforest, because kind of that's like the lowland Amazon. My research is in the upper Amazon. So where there is an elevation of 4,000 feet, right? So it's different than the idea that we have about rainforest because of the elevation, which makes the climate different and the environment very different from just what we see in the movies when the Amazon is portrayed.
Right. Yeah, and it's incredibly interesting how the people are so used to these they're so used to the land. And for us, it takes an extreme adjustment to switch to that. Just like if for them they came here, it would be a big adjustment. So it's interesting that they live in such a different way when it comes to geographic position and transportation, which is a big part of anybody's life. But you were still able to understand, and they were able to understand you that on a very human level. Like it doesn't matter the conditions, so to speak, because we're all kind of part of the same thing. It's interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I always encourage my students to travel. I always encourage my students to see beyond, right? And to try to, because it is an effort. And if you haven't really, if most of your life you've kind of surrounded yourself by the same people and by the same culture and the same kind of environment. I mean, it's only going to make it harder when you go to other places and you see a different kind of environment and you run into people who look different than you or who have different practices. So, yes, I mean, here at URI, I try to expose students to different realities in Latin America, not just indigenous realities, right? The reality of indigenous people, but also the reality of women, right? Let's talk about women and what's the reality of women in Latin America or young people in Latin America or elderly, right? I mean, it's getting exposed to every single part of the society, and you can do it through reading, and you can do it by showing students movies and stuff like that, but or talking about food, right? Food is something that, I mean, Latin American food, it has its own hype. So there are a lot of students who have probably they didn't know anything about Latin America, but they have tried food, specifically here in Rhode Island, Colombian food, right, or Venezuelan food. I mean, they have tried the empanadas. So they are aware of something that has to do with Latin America. And that's, I mean, I feel like that's a good step. I mean, the more exposed you are, the more willing you are to travel to different places and to communicate and to understand each other. So yes, completely agree to what you said.
Now, you spoke a lot about one of the main struggles of the people there is gaining their territorial rights. What is the process, to your understanding, what is the process that an indigenous community in Latin America has to kind of go through? What are the hoops they kind of have to jump through to make that happen? And once it happens, how set in stone historically is it? So
again, and that was a previous research that I did. So I'm not up to date on what needs to be done today, right? But
Sure.
by the time that I did my research, what they had to get is like they had to get an official recognition of the government first, that they existed as an indigenous community, as an indigenous group, right? And the laws are different in different parts of Latin America regarding indigenous peoples and their lands and the territories that they have. In Peru, what happens is that if you are legally recognized as an indigenous community, and they call it comunidad nativa, so as a native community, if you're officially recognized as such, then you have the right to own that land, and owning that land, you do it as a community, right? It's not like I have this land and then people have independent plots of land. Is that you have a land that is for the whole community, and that is part of your right. So that is in the law of Peru. That's part of the Peruvian law. But the problem is that there is this kind of like previous step, which is being recognized as an indigenous community first, right? So that was a big challenge for indigenous communities at the time that I was doing my research, because how is that they can present themselves as indigenous people in front of people who, I mean, they come as representatives of the government, they come from the big city, and then they are supposed to somehow make sure that these people are actually indigenous people. And then they, so it gets messy because you have outsiders, people who don't really live there, people who don't have a whole lot of ideas about this area or the people living in these areas. You have people representing the Peruvian government who have to go and they have to kind of like grant the official recognition of these indigenous communities, right? So that's the first step. And it's hard because it means that you have to submit paperwork. And if you have to submit paperwork, what kind of paperwork, right? And we've all dealt with bureaucracy. So we all know how it's just like one paper after one paper, submitting different kinds of stuff, where, how, who, right? Do you need a lawyer? Do you need to notarize these documents? So it's just a lot of time, energy, knowledge that not necessarily is kind of like publicly available. And sometimes when something is publicly available, even then it's kind of like hard to make sense of. So all those are a lot of challenges that indigenous people have to face. They need to have some money. They need to have the money to send a lawyer from one place to another place, right? They have to fly. They have to stay there. They need to have money for lodging, right? Food. How do you get that, right? From where? So it's a lot of work, and indigenous communities are making it happen. I mean, they create alliances with non-governmental entities, and also they try to get involved in different initiatives, whether they are coming from the government or not, so they can kind of like get some resources to start that process of recognition. And after they continue that process, then they have to wait, and for how long? So it's just bureaucracy, and they have to make sense of it all the time, right?
Right. Well, it's a testament to how strong the indigenous communities are, that they're still able to make an impact, and they're still able to fight for the things that they believe they have the right to. I mean, those communities have been living a certain way for a very long time, longer than the way we all live now. Humans lived that way far longer than they did, or they have been the way we are now. So it's an unfortunate circumstance that they're kind of looked upon as a separate entity in society, and that because there's so much that we could learn from them. And this is just me kind of logically putting the pieces together. a civilization that has been around as long as some of these indigenous places all over the world, I'm sure could help these quote unquote more civilized, if you want to call them that, societies, or the outside world as you refer to them. They could definitely advise us on certain ways to live and how to build our own communities, maybe in a similar way, but in a more modern way, something like that. It's just strange that they're looked at as their own thing, as outsiders to us, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, differences. I think humans, we're all, I mean, designed to make a difference between us and the others, right? And that is something that it will never really change. I think it's just a matter of curiosity and a matter of the information is there. It's just like, probably that's the downside. We have so much information that it's hard to access specifically what you want. It's just that you're overwhelmed by so much information that sometimes that takes up space, and then you don't search beyond what you really want. So I don't know what's the answer to that, but I do think that there are more ways of finding out about what's happening to indigenous groups, or not just indigenous groups, but marginalized majorities that are living in the world, and it's just a matter of trying and creating the awareness of it, for sure.
Now, to wrap this up, I think I remember when we first met, you had mentioned you would be working on a book on this topic. Yeah. Yes. That is the goal. I did, like I said, I did my research, and it started in the 16th century and went all the way to the 19th century. And it's about the upper region of the Amazons and the local views about the region, and how is that they interacted with outsiders, whether it's like the Spanish conquistadors or scientific expeditions or missionaries, right? So I looked at this region and the interactions with indigenous groups of this region historically, right? And I start all the way in the 16th century. And that's going to be a book, hopefully, that kind of like brings a little bit of light about this region and about the groups of people living there, and how is that when we think about the Amazon, we can think about them and their history, right? And that's something that I'm trying to do, and that's my project for the near future. Right. Well, you're incredibly passionate about it, and you're incredibly qualified. So anytime you have someone that is creating a piece of literature or something informative for people, those are a couple things that you'd like to check off the box for the author or for the creator. So I am looking forward to it. I hope we stay in touch, and I want a copy of it. It already sounds interesting to me.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anywhere people can find your writings? Do you have anything like that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I have a website, and my website is my name and my last name. So Ximena with X, Sevilla.com. And that's where I post most of my stuff and links and talks and stuff like that. So if you can share that would be awesome.
Yeah, we'll put it in the description of the episode. Not a problem at all.
Good. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Everybody, thank you so much for listening today. Follow the show wherever you listen. Links in the description. Check out Dr. Sevilla's website if any of this was interesting. I think it's incredibly interesting. I'm sure some of the viewers will as well. I want to say thank you very much for coming on. I definitely appreciate the conversation. And I hope to have you on again someday.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good luck, and hi to all the listeners.
Thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon. Peace.